Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to In With the Old. We are a podcast focused on dispelling myths, building appreciation for God's Word, and helping you rediscover the Old Testament for the life of faith. My name is Dr. Tim Howe, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Brian Koning, as we are going through the book of Habakkuk. Now, we're in season 5 of In With the Old. Last week, we talked about what it means to be a prophet. What are the minor prophets? We just tried to provide some context for what we're about to dive into. And today, we're going to be doing our introductory episode on the book of Habakkuk itself. And it just so happens that we have a content expert in the room. So, Dr. Brian Koning, how are you doing today? And how are you feeling getting into this episode?
Well, in the room in a digital sense, I guess, right? But, I'm excited. We've done a singular episode on Habakkuk before in the past, but when Tim and I were starting to talk about, hey, we want to go through full books, this is a book I can talk about a lot. And I told Tim as we were preparing for this, all right, make sure I don't start rambling too much. But it's an exciting book, and I hope over these next coming weeks, Tim, for both you and I, as well as our listeners, that we can see some of the beautiful truths and wrestle with some of the profound challenges. This is not a book that is going to give us a very simplistic, a very easy to digest theological message, but it's going to push us. And so I'm excited, but also there's a little trepidation as well, as we're going to be stepping on some very difficult and very real issues. But I'm excited, and I'm ready to get into it, Tim.
Perfect. Well, listeners, strap on your seatbelt because we're about to blast off here, and we're beginning with a question. And this is the question that really kind of lurks in the background of Habakkuk the entire time. And the question is this: if there is a God, why do I suffer? Brian, this is a question that we think of often in our own experience, and yet sometimes I think we don't give ourselves permission to articulate it. But I know one of the things you and I love about the Old Testament is it's raw, it's real, and Habakkuk has this very real and nagging question. If there's a God, why do we suffer? And why do we suffer at the hands of these people? Why doesn't God intervene? So Brian, help us understand, situate us. You are the expert in Habakkuk as we think about this. So help us to understand what is going on as we are about to dive into the book of Habakkuk verse by verse.
Yeah, the question of suffering is a essential question that, unfortunately, I think we can all relate to. Tim, for myself, at least growing up, there was often this idea of you praise God for his goodness, and when suffering's there, you kind of wring your hands and go, well, God doesn't want this. But I don't know how much, at least for myself, how much I felt like I could explore that question and ask, where is God in the midst of suffering? And that's the question that's at the heart of Habakkuk, right? Where is God in the midst of suffering? What's God's relationship to suffering? And I think the more we allow ourselves to wrestle with that question, the deeper our faith will get. I have a quote I wanted to read for us. It's from Miguel de Unamuno, and this quote actually led off my dissertation. The first chapter of it, I have quotes for every chapter. And this was the quote for chapter 1. And listeners, I want you to listen to it because this has always really stuck with me. Unamuno, in Tragic Sense of Life, said this: those who say they believe in God, yet neither love nor fear him, do not in fact believe in him, but in those who have taught him that God exists. Those who believe that they believe in God, but without any passion in their heart, without anguish of mind, without uncertainty, without doubt, without an element of despair even in their consolation, believe only in the God idea, not in God. And that really resonated with me, Tim, growing up, dealing with questions of suffering, because I've shared on this podcast before. I lost my dad in college. I've gone through things that made me really kind of question God in the midst of suffering. And it really forced me to confront that if we have a relationship with God, a real relationship, that should be filled with real emotions, dealing with the realities of life. If we have a relationship with God that doesn't allow for questions of suffering, questions for trying to wrestle through where is God when things go really, really bad, we may, as Unamuno says, believe only in the idea of God and not actually in God. And so this book, Habakkuk, is one of these books that I want to encourage listeners to come to if you're in the midst of difficult times. We often go to Job for answers to theodicy, and that's not wrong. Job has lots of answers to the question of theodicy or the justification of God. Where is God in the midst of suffering? Theodicy is just our technical term. But this minor prophet has a not so minor voice on this question. And I think complements Job in some really interesting ways that we're going to dive into, Tim.
Mm.
But that's kind of my pitch for the book. If you've really wrestled with where is God in the midst of suffering, if you've gone through Job and say, I still have questions, well, let's come to this guy. Habakkuk has something to say to us today, I think.
Yeah, he certainly does, Brian. And just even as we think about the question of suffering personally and experientially, the Bible talks about how we can't truly understand someone else's pain, right? And the Bible also talks about in the book of Proverbs that when someone, someone might seem to be glad or their laughter might be covering up what truly is going on in their heart, essentially saying that when you see someone smile, that doesn't mean that they're truly joyful or and here's what I'm getting at. The suffering that we see in scriptures and the reflections on suffering, whether it's Job or Habakkuk or Ecclesiastes or others as well, when we consider those, they really are also personal, which I think reflects the truly personal nature of suffering in general. It's one thing to know pain and grief. We all know pain and grief, but as we try to work through those, that pain and grief is always wrapped up with the particularities of our individual story. And that's why we are so prone, like Habakkuk, to say, Lord, what do I do in this instance? Right? It's not, theodicy is really not about the suffering in the world in general. It's about, why am I experiencing this? Why am I going through this? And that's what makes Habakkuk, in a sense, compelling, is because he's talking about a very specific instance or a very specific circumstance. And yet that's also what we have to talk about as we introduce it. We're not exactly sure what those circumstances are. So, Brian, as we think about the personal nature of suffering, let's maybe talk about who Habakkuk is. What do we know? What's kind of his biographical sketch? What are we able to discern? What are we not able to discern? Can you just walk us through that?
Yeah, so the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, exists in a time where it is the primary historical document for the nation of Israel, which means if it doesn't tell us a lot about someone, we don't have a lot about them. So there are some prophets whose books include biographic details, right? So you could pick up Isaiah, you could pick up Jeremiah, and it'll kind of situate you in the world that they're living in. Here's the king, here's where we're at, here's the time period, those things like that. Listeners, if you've picked up the book of Habakkuk, you'll look through it and go, oh, it gives us nothing aside from his name. And that makes it a little bit difficult to kind of go, okay, all right, we have to kind of fill in some of the blanks to figure out, where are we? When is this book written? Where is the book written? What is it talking about? Now, thankfully, we can infer, even though we just have a name, we can infer quite a bit from that and the book itself. So the name, Tim, is quite interesting. The name is not Hebrew. There's a chance, or at least rather the rabbis like to make an argument that the name comes from the verb to embrace. And they're trying to connect Habakkuk back to the dead son of the Shunammite woman, who the son comes back to life. But that chronologically doesn't fit with some things we're going to look at here in a moment. But likely his name comes from an Akkadian loan word for Amakuku. This is important because it suggests when we're in time. Akkadian, the Akkadian Empire has more influence over Israel and over Judah in the latter part. So we're talking 8th through 6th century, more like 7th, but sometime in there. This puts us near the end of the Old Testament timeline. If Habakkuk is talking in the 7th century, that means he's contemporaries with other prophets like Zephaniah and Jeremiah. And as we read through the book, a lot of his complaints seem to fit that setting. We are at a time of moral degradation. Even the priesthood is not really following after Yahweh much anymore. Another clue we can glean from the book is chapter 3. Chapter 3 is a psalm that has musical notations as well. this potentially indicates Habakkuk is connected in some way with the temple, because that was not just the main religious center of ancient Israel, that was the main musical center as well. It was the priests, right, who have responsibilities with the psalter and with arranging music. So maybe that helps us there. But beyond that, we have to kind of give a shrug.
Mm.
Now, because we don't have a lot, Tim,
Mhm.
humans are humans across time. In the absence of information, we like to make up information. And so we do have historical fan fiction. Listeners, if you're familiar with the Deuterocanonical books or the Apocrypha, there's an extra chapter in the book of Daniel called Bel and the Dragon. And in that chapter, Habakkuk is actually transported via Angel Express to give food to Daniel in the lion's den. Now, that also doesn't line up in history. That's 150 years apart. But he's there. As I said, the rabbis try to put him further back in history to be connected to the Shunammite woman. But neither of those really hold weight. So don't have a lot about the man. Probably 7th century. Some of the other details we'll look at here in a moment will corroborate that. But he does stand as a little bit of an empty character, which I think helps us because his complaint is going to be something that we can put ourselves into, unfortunately, quite easily with
Mhm.
regards to suffering.
Mhm.
Now, that's all we got for the man, Tim.
Mhm.
Now, when did he live and when did he write? I already brought up the 7th century.
Mhm.
For simplicity's sake, listeners, we're going to handle these questions as one and the same. But full disclosure, just because the prophet lives in the 7th century doesn't mean the book was written necessarily in the 7th century. There is some academic debate about that. We're going to conflate the two issues and just treat them as one. But there is more here. So, the two things I look at as a Habakkuk scholar to try to date this book is who are the Chaldeans and what is the wickedness Habakkuk is complaining about.
Mhm.
Now, first question, who are the Chaldeans? So the Chaldeans are mentioned in this book as the answer to Habakkuk's complaint and the proof that you really should be careful what you ask for because God may give it to you and you may not like it.
Mhm.
Habakkuk is going to complain about sin. Where's God? And God says, don't worry, I'm sending the Chaldeans to punish you. But who are these Chaldeans? Well, the easiest reference, the most likely reference, and the reference I think it is this is a reference to the Babylonian Empire or the Neo Babylonian Empire, or it has several different titles, but we usually just call them the Babylonians. This empire begins in the year 627 BC when Nabopolassar seizes the throne after the death of a Neo Assyrian king, Kandalanu. Now, his son is actually the Babylonian king that you and I, as churchgoers, maybe are familiar with. His son is Nebuchadnezzar II. He eventually is the king that is going to expand, overthrow the failing Assyrian Empire, expand the Babylonian Empire, and eventually be the one to capture Jerusalem and lead the people, including Daniel, off into captivity. Right, this takes place in the Bible in 2 Kings 24 and 25. Term Chaldeans is used around 80 times in the Old Testament, and as far as I'm aware, Tim, and correct me if you found a different reference here, but every one of those times, as far as I can tell, it means this Babylonian Empire, started
Mhm.
by Nabopolassar, perfected or brought to its height by Nebuchadnezzar II.
Mhm.
Ezekiel 23:15, by the way, I think really helps lock this down because Ezekiel calls the Babylonians, he says they come from Chaldea, the land of their relations. So
Mhm.
Chaldea is their land, hence Chaldeans, those from Chaldea, are Babylonians. So at least with that, that's how I would lock it down. Tim, have you heard any other arguments for who the Chaldeans may be, or any bits of data I missed on this before we talk about the wickedness of Habakkuk?
No, I haven't. And to me that fits like a glove, especially in light of what we know of the history of Israel, right? The argument of Habakkuk is, Lord, or at least part of the argument is, how can you use those who are more evil than we are to punish our wickedness? And so
Yeah.
we have to have a candidate that is very much interwoven with the history of Israel as we have it in the scriptures. And the Chaldeans are the obvious candidate, or I should say, the Babylonians are the obvious candidate for the Chaldeans. So I think that is spot on, Brian.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things is there's two parts to this. Who are the Chaldeans? They have to be someone known to Habakkuk, because throughout the whole book, he never questions, like, who are these people? Right? It's not like the book says, I'm going to bring in the Russians. And Habakkuk would be like, who? Like, that's not a name we've encountered so far. So it
Yeah.
has to be a people group Habakkuk is aware of. And yet he is shocked that God would use them,
Mhm.
indicating that they aren't the dominant world power. So you have this interesting balancing act that Babylon has to have been at least introduced on the world stage, and yet their predecessor empire, the Assyrians, have to still be the dominant empire. That shift, by the way, from Babylon taking over, and especially when they defeat Egypt and Pharaoh Necho II, great name for a pharaoh, by the way, is 605 BC. That's the Battle of Carchemish. It's a fairly famous battle in the ancient world. So you have this like 30 to 70 year period. Babylon, by the way, did come to Israel when they were a puppet state of Assyria, asking for support to defeat Assyria. Israel turned them down. So you do have this, they are known, but they're a puppet state. So you have a 70-year window, basically from the beginning of the 7th century to about 620. Maybe you could push it to 605 BC in the 7th century. But that seems to be, that's why I've been saying 7th century. That seems to be one of the better dating candidates for when Habakkuk's story takes place. The other thing is, as I said, the wickedness of Habakkuk, meaning the book, not the prophet. What is he complaining about? Unfortunately, that doesn't help us as much as we might think. Because if you read the Bible, things are kind of going bad by the end of the story. And you have, well, is he talking about Manasseh? Is he talking about Jehoiakim? Is he talking about Josiah Reformation issues? Like, you can just throw a dart at a king in the Old Testament and you'll have some sort of issue that might fit this. So that doesn't necessarily help us, but it does indicate, I think, we're near the end of the story when these issues are becoming so egregious you can't ignore them anymore, right? Even the common person on the street is like, where is God? Because sin is abounding in the kingdom. So you put all this together, we are kind of we're lacking a lot of information we might have for other prophets. I don't think that's going to be as detrimental as we might expect, because this message, and this is one of the beautiful things I love about Habakkuk, Tim, the message is both in time but timeless, right? It is going to come about because of a specific set of circumstances we'll talk about more next episode. But the message of Habakkuk of God, where are you in the midst of pain, transfers. And it's a relevant question. It was relevant then, it's relevant now. And maybe that's a good segue into what is the point of the book. I've got my answer, Tim, but you keep pointing like that. I'm the expert in the room. You, of course, have also studied Habakkuk. You've gone through it numerous times. So if I can put you on the spot, if I said, give me a one sentence like summary pitch for what this book is, what would you say? Putting you on the spot. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to provide an answer that's more of a bunt than a hit.
All right.
I think that in terms of our takeaway, so I'm not saying this is the message of the book itself, but I think one of the takeaways for us is God gives us permission to ask these questions. For readers or for listeners rather, as you listen to Brian and I kind of talk about, okay, who are the Chaldeans? When did they rise to power? Neo-Babylonians, Neo-Assyrians, this Pharaoh, that person, this alliance, that political reality. Like it's mind dizzying, right? It's hard to keep track of. And even with all the various records that exist, there's a lot that's still unknown. But for me, when we look at Habakkuk, it's an incredible recording of a man whose heart is weighed down by what he sees as violence, injustice, something that in his mind doesn't make sense. And yet he, as a prophet, is one who's part of the counsels of God. In other words, so what do you do whenever someone who is supposed to, from an earthly perspective, see and understand more than anyone else, looks at something and says, I don't see or understand anything about this? And yet the takeaway in a sense is God gives us permission even as his children, even as his servants, to come to him and say, God, I'm going to stand at my post and I'm going to wait for you to respond. So that's kind of a bunt to get us on the base of the message. But I think that's a good starting point, is that it has more to do with the freedom to, in faith, ask God these questions, rather than shutting down the conversation and saying, well, if you even begin to question God at all, that must mean that you are somehow his enemy. No, here is a servant of God coming before God in humility, but in truth and in boldness, saying, God, where are you? Where are you? So even the freedom to ask the question is, to me, one of the most important messages that sort of underlies the text. But Brian, what about you? What's your one sentence summary, or what's your briefest summary of the message of the book?
Well, I thought that was a good bunt, Tim. That was right down the third base line. Died about 5 feet in front of the bag. It was excellent. Got you on base.
All right, good.
My one sentence summary. I would go back to the quote from De Unamuno. That a person in relationship with God, not just the idea of God, but God himself, is going to have a more complicated, more difficult wrestling through of life than we often expect. This book is complicated. Habakkuk is going to say some things, friends, that throughout history, people have not been comfortable with him having said that to God. We'll hit that in our very next episode. His first complaint has some, shall we say, rather direct language on how he's challenging God. And yet, through this complicated relationship, he is trying to work out theology. He's trying to understand the living God in the midst of a broken world. And there's no simple answer. There's no bumper sticker that's going to fix this, right? We can't just go down to get our precious moments postcard and that's sufficient. Instead, we're going to see a dialogue, a back and forth between the prophet and God, wrestling through, frankly, the very complicated and very intricate answers to how God rightly runs the world, culminating ultimately, and I'll give the tea away, as it were, in the last verse of chapter 2. That's God's conclusion. You can go look it up as soon as we're done. But it's interesting how we get to that conclusion. And I'm going to point out God's conclusion is the last verse of chapter 2, not the first verse of chapter 1. And that in itself is significant. We take time to get to this conclusion. We don't jump to it. We work through it. Chapter 3 then shows us the working out of the prophet as he figures out how this conclusion applies to his life. I'm intentionally being vague because I want to either encourage you to go look at what this verse is or follow us through our time as we begin unpacking some of these messages. But to go back to my summary, Tim, this shows that a person who believes in God is going to have to wrestle with the intricacies of life, and that I don't think simplistic faith helps us. True faith in a true God requires some deep soul searching and requires some discomfort. We're going to see the prophet, after having given his second complaint, Tim already alluded to it, he says, I'm going to go sit on my watchtower and wait to see what God says to me. There's a lot there that he can't force God to answer. He says, I'm going to have to sit and wait. I have to actually go through the discomfort of not knowing and not knowing when the answer is going to come. There's a lot in this book. I really hope you'll join us, because this is one of my favorite books. I think this book, Tim, has really helped shape a lot of the more pastoral elements of my theology and how I work through pain, how I help others maybe work through pain and the consequences of sin. Yeah, I'm excited. Just as a teaser overall, friends, this book is going to help us to explore themes of sin, God, national trouble, talking to God, prayer, and much, much more. So starting next week, we're going to be diving in. We'll be looking at Habakkuk's first complaint in Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And I'm looking forward to talking to you all then. Tim, until they come listen to us next time, do you have any last words for our listeners?
I'm excited for this, Brian, for the same reason I said up front. It gives us not just a permission, but an awareness that humans struggle with these things, and again, this is part of why we exist as a podcast. We want to dive into the problem, not run away from it. We want to squeeze out every drop of what God is trying to show us. And of course, we're believers, Brian. It's not that we're forgetting the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. It's not that we're ignoring some subsequent revelation, but even so, Christians live in a fallen world. The gospel it does not somehow alleviate the pain or the responsibility we have to deal with these questions. So this is very relevant, and especially for our listeners, for friends and family that we have that struggle with the deep questions of faith and God's purposes and plans. Please let them know about this. These are the kind of things that unfortunately many people have been told, you can't talk about this, you can't think about this, you can't say this. And I've seen people whose faith has unfortunately crumbled under the weight of not feeling like they can ask the same questions that we read Habakkuk himself asking. That's a tragedy, and that's what we want to help with. So listeners, thank you so much. Dr. Brian, thank you for joining us. We're going to hit episode 3 next week, going through the book verse by verse. So listeners, we hope you join us then. And until next time, stay cool and stay old.